This morning, we are in a series that we've been in since the end of August. Since the end of August, we've been in this series, Sermon on the Mount. If you're over there, I'm so sorry. Just if you can try to see anything on that screen, then great. If not, don't worry about it. We started this series back in August, and we're going to be in this series all the way through the end of October. I think we are taking 10 total weeks to go through what is one of the most famous passages in all of Scripture, definitely one of the most famous teachings, if not the most famous teaching from the person of Jesus. The biographer, Matthew, records it in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of his gospel. He didn't actually create the chapter divisions. Those were added later, and we just kind of use them as a helpful reference. But in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the Gospel of Matthew, we see Jesus give really kind of his manifesto for how to live. And we've kind of been slowly making our way through that. And we're going to start again today. We're going to jump into chapter 6, verses 1 through 18 in a little while. But I am going to leave out, just so you know, for those of you who like take notes and stuff, we're going to look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18. In that section is the Lord's Prayer. I'm not going to touch that at all. We're going to talk about that a little bit next week. But this morning, I'm just going to look at kind of the surrounding passage or the surrounding verses to that particular passage. With all that said, I'm going to get started. I was somewhere in between 8th and 10th grade when I found a website that allowed me to purchase followers for my Instagram account. And so I did. I purchased followers, not like a lot, okay, because I needed to keep it realistic, but just enough to kind of get my following to follower ratio a little bit more ideal. That is something that millennials cared about when they were teenagers, was kind of what that ratio was. So I did it, and I eventually ended up deleting that account. If you were to ask 14-year-old me, hey, why did you do that? Like, that is awkward. Why did you do that? To be honest, I probably would have lied. I probably would have came up with the story or probably would have deflected the question or whatever, but I definitely wouldn't have been truthful because whether I recognized it or not at that time, that version of me just cared a lot about what other people thought of me. So buying followers, it was really just one thing that I did among other things, where I tried to make myself and kind of my persona look better than it really was. Try to make myself appear more popular than I actually was. And I wasn't alone, okay? According to some research out there, around 40% of people misrepresent themselves online, and that number doubles once you start gauging individuals who are trying to date. So people who are looking for a significant other in any way online, the guess is about 80% of those people tend to lie or exaggerate things about themselves to make them look better. And my guess is that those numbers probably don't shock us. About 80% of people kind of, try to make themselves look better than they really are because all of us, I would say, in our own way, it's different, but all of us in our own way, we all want people to think of us a certain way. Now, some of us think of that more often than others, but it's human nature for all of us to want other people to think of us in a positive way. It just might differ in terms of the specifics. So some of us, we want to be thought of as attractive, and therefore we put a lot of attention and effort into our appearance, and we might downplay it, but we care. Some of us want to be thought of as athletic or talented or gifted, so we work really hard at our craft because, quite frankly, we feel like that's what we're known for, that's what people value us for. Some of us, we want other people to think that we are good Christians. So, we find ways to display our spirituality in front of others because we want to be perceived in a way that's positive. I would say in our own ways, we all ask ourselves the question from time to time, what are they going to think about me? And like I said, it's human nature to want others to think of us in a positive way. This way we are accepted into a group. This way there are other people who care about us. And therefore, it's kind of an automatic response sometimes to do whatever it takes to get people to think of us in a positive way. We might even lie or exaggerate certain stories just so that people will listen to us. We might share certain things about ourselves while hiding other things. We might participate in certain activities that we know maybe that's not good for us, but if it's going to get me in with this group or if it's going to look good for someone else, then maybe I'm willing to do it. And the way we try to impress other people, it's going to look different for all of us, but the fact that we try to impress other people, well, that's just kind of what humans have always done. And that's why there is a particular teaching from Jesus that addresses this very subject. Now, I have to say that in the cultural moment of Jesus' day, that human temptation to make yourself look better than you actually are, to appear better and to impress other people, it was there, but it showed up in different ways. In first century Judaism, which is the time period and the culture that we see Jesus exist in, many people felt the pressure not just to be religious, but to appear religious, okay? Like for them, religion wasn't even a subcategory of the rest of life. It was everything for their culture and for their environment in ways that's very difficult for us to understand in kind of a modern Western world. But people in this culture were not content to just live a certain way. They wanted to be seen living a certain way. And Jesus was so aware of this practice of people doing things in order to impress other people, in order to appear better than they really were, that he actually addressed it. And here's the teaching for those of you who can see that screen. Jesus said, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. That's Matthew chapter 6. It's the first verse of Matthew chapter 6. And as you notice, it says NIV. That is the way that the New International Committee of Translators have decided to translate that verse. I want to show you Eugene Peterson's translation. He is not trying to be technical in his translation at all, which just means like he's not trying to reflect the underlying Greek structure of the passage that Matthew wrote. He's just trying to convey the big idea. So here's how Eugene Peterson translates Matthew chapter 6, verse 1. We'll throw it on underneath. It says, be especially careful when you are trying to be good so that you don't make a performance out of it. It might be good theater, but the God who made you won't be applauding. Now, that sentence, it's the same sentence, it's just translated a different way. That sentence functions as Jesus' thesis statement for the next 17 verses. And you can tell not just because of the content, but also because of the way he structures his material. You see, after verse 1, Jesus goes on to apply that principle that he's communicating right there. He goes on to apply it to 3 areas of life: giving money to those in need, prayer, and fasting. And for each of those examples that Jesus gives, they all follow a similar format. It goes something like this. He says, when you give or when you pray or when you fast, don't act like the hypocrites who live to be seen by others. That's italicized because the actual wording there is going to be different depending on the teaching, but that is the essence of what he's communicating. Don't act like the hypocrites who live to be seen by others. They have received their reward. Instead, whenever you give, pray, or fast, do it in secret, and your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you. Jesus uses that same structure 3 times, okay? So to be clear, each of those topics, giving, prayer, and fasting, those are their own little teachings in Matthew chapter 6. In verses 2 through 4, he talks about money. In verses 5 through 15, he talks about prayer. And in verses 16 through 18, he talks about fasting. But he uses that same structure for each activity. And remember, Jesus is addressing a people group who really want to appear righteous because of their cultural context. When many of us think of how we want to appear, we wouldn't use the word righteous unless we really are just kind of thinking in the context of our Christian communities. But this principle is still going to be very valuable for us. However, before I apply it to our cultural moment, I want to say a quick word about the examples that Jesus uses. 3 examples. He says, when you give to the needy, when you pray, and when you fast. The first thing I want you to notice is that Jesus starts this teaching by saying when you do these things. Meaning that Jesus expected his followers to practice those disciplines on the screen as well as other ones. These are the 3 examples that Jesus uses just because those were 3 of the fundamental disciplines within the Judaism of his day. If you study faith traditions kind of globally, like Christianity and other ones, you'll notice every community of faith, they tend to develop their kind of priority set of disciplines at different times. So in our community, in our kind of tradition of the church, you would recognize if I were to ask you, hey, how do you grow in your righteousness? How do you practice your faith? We would probably identify some of the top practices as going to church, praying, and reading our Bible. Well, in the first century, giving money, prayer, and fasting were 3 of the fundamental disciplines for a God follower. So giving to the needy, or sometimes it's translated as almsgiving, if you have an older translation, it was the Israelite practice of supporting people in the community who needed financial assistance. Kind of charitable giving. Think of you or your family have probably given money to people who are unhoused or people who you just kind of see on the side of freeways. During this time, there was no government assistance program for anyone to benefit from. So if an individual needed help, it was entirely up to their community. And there's a number of historians who write about how Christianity is actually responsible for the development of the welfare state. You and I just take for granted, like, hey, there should be some social institution out there that helps people who are in need. That's kind of a Christian idea that arose, from Christianity's then history within Judaism. And the fact that Jesus has teachings about how to handle money, I think, is especially significant for those of you who are at the age where you are either working or you're going to start working soon. I would highly recommend that you start learning about the way Jesus followers should handle their money, because that's an area of life that's really easy to overlook, but it's actually a subject that the scriptures say a lot about. The next discipline is prayer, and he uses the same format for prayer. He just says, when you pray, don't act like the hypocrites who try to impress other people with their prayers. Rather, pray in secret. And then lastly, fasting. Fasting is when someone does not eat food for a period of time so they can focus more on God. Fasting has always been a popular discipline within Christian faith up until really just a couple hundred years ago. When Jesus lived, it was common for Jews to fast about twice a week. That practice was picked up by early Christians, but for a variety of reasons, most of us do not fast. Most of our families do not fast, and I would say most Christians in our part of the world, in North America, do not fast today. There's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is that in America, a lot of people have an unfortunate relationship with food. And I did want to take a moment here to just make a brief pastoral sidebar. There's some research out there that suggests that around 20% of teenagers, or 1 in every 5 students, may struggle with an unhealthy relationship to food. And I'm just sharing the stats. The problem is much more prevalent among girls than guys. You see, some of us, if we're honest, we skip meals because we are afraid of gaining weight. Some of us, we find emotional comfort or support in food. And some of us have identified these things are a problem, but you're just too embarrassed to say anything. And then here comes Jesus saying, when you fast. You see, similar to the way that we handle money, and even similar to prayer, Jesus actually has guidance for the way that you and I relate to food. Now, this is not a teaching on fasting or on food, so I'm intentionally leaving a lot of unanswered questions here. But since our passage mentions some of Jesus's instructions regarding food, I kind of just saw this moment as an opportunity to encourage anyone in here who is struggling in their relationship to food, that is something God cares about. And my encouragement to you is for you to pray and for you to ask God who you should start a conversation with so that you can potentially start a journey of healing. Money, prayer, food. 3 examples, but remember, he's actually communicating one idea. And it has to do with how we try to make ourselves look better than we actually are. If we go back to the structure breakdown of Jesus' examples, I want you to notice one word that he uses over and over again. It's underlined in that second passage. It's the word hypocrite. Whenever you give, pray, or fast, don't act like the hypocrites. In its original context, that word hypocrite, it didn't have the negative connotations that we associate it with today. That actually comes from this passage and from the teaching of Jesus. In its original context, that word, it was just used for someone who was an actor or an actress. When you see an actor or an actress in a film, you know they are playing a role. They are not being themselves, rather they are pretending to be someone that they aren't. And if you are acting in a film, that is entirely appropriate. But if you were to go through life acting like something you're not, well, that's a problem. And according to Jesus, we act like hypocrites, not just when we try to be someone we're not. It actually is more specific. According to Jesus, we act like hypocrites whenever we do things in order to be seen and noticed by others. Whenever I make any decision and the goal is to impress other people, Jesus teaches that I will get my reward. I will get noticed by other people, but I will get nothing from God. And this gets to the heart of why Jesus wants us to think about this, because if you live your life always trying to impress other people, what you're going to miss out on is intimacy with God. If your mind is always preoccupied with what are they thinking about me, you're not going to have any space to consider what is God saying to me. Now remember, Jesus is using specific examples here in this context. He says, when you give, pray, and fast, don't do it like the hypocrites just to be noticed. So it's very important that we practice those disciplines and other Christian disciplines with the right motivations. Your generation doesn't really do this. Millennial girls, they were famous for posting pictures whenever they would read their Bible, and they would have like very fancy highlighting and then all these notes in the margins. And I'm not saying that every post like this is for this purpose, but sometimes the vibe that was created was that they were doing something good, but it was in order to be seen for doing something good. So the way we go about Christian practices, they matter. But the reality is, there are so many other ways that you and I can do things in order to be seen by other people, in order to impress them. And the contrast that Jesus gives us is that we can either live our life trying to make ourselves look better, or we can live our life getting to know God better, but we cannot do both at the same time. I'll say it this way, and it'll be on our one trusty screen over here. If you live your life for people, you'll miss out on life with God. If you live your life for people, you'll miss out on life with God. If you live your life with the focus and the goal of getting other people to like you or think positively about you, you're not going to have any attention left over to give to God. And that's why what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew chapter 6, this is so much more important than just not caring about what other people think. That's commonly passed off as good advice. Hey, don't care what other people think. Like, just be yourself. Like, who cares what other people think? Some of you, you naturally care more than others what people think about you. So you've kind of been, this message has been easier for you to pay attention to just because you're aware, hey, that's something I care about. Others of us, you don't really struggle that much with caring about what other people think of you, but that doesn't mean you are automatically focused on what God thinks. It just means you're less concerned about the opinions of others, which is a start. But Jesus isn't after just getting us to not care. Jesus is actually after our attention. He's actually giving us guidance here on how to become people who experience more of God. He is actually giving us the pathway on how to become more secure, on how to become less worried and less anxious, that instead of living our life wondering, what are they thinking about me, or even being dominated by what we think about ourselves, he's actually guiding us on how we could grow into people who go through life more aware of what is God doing in my life and what is God doing in the lives of people around me. So here is my recommendation to you. As a super simple way to put this into practice, I'm going to suggest that you start asking yourself a question. And I would even say, maybe try asking yourself this question every day this week. Just give it a try, and if it's helpful, great. If it's not, you don't have to ask yourself anymore. Here's the question. It'll be over there. Why am I doing this really? Why am I doing this really? Why am I posting this really? Why am I sending this really? Why am I acting this way really? Why am I doing this really? You see, the point of this question is to help us reflect on why we make the decisions that we do, which is really what Jesus is primarily concerned with in this portion of Matthew chapter 6. He is calling us to examine our hearts and our motivations, not just for what we do, but for why we do the things that we do. And this week, you're gonna make a lot of decisions, a lot of little decisions. Some of you are gonna have the opportunity to do something, and you know it might be bad for you, but you also know it'll make you look better in front of a certain group of people. Some of you are gonna have the opportunity to lie or exaggerate certain stories. You may even have the chance to buy things that you know are gonna impress other people. And when those moments arrive, my recommendation for you is to ask yourself the question, why am I doing this really? Because if we can get good at asking ourselves that question and answering honestly, then we are taking our first steps away from living our lives for other people and towards living our life with God. And remember, Jesus promises that when we fight the desire to find our identity in what other people think of us, and we focus on who our Heavenly Father is and what he thinks of us, he says we're going to discover a better reward. And I know, at least in part, that part of what that reward is us getting a better picture of who Jesus is and of who he's created us to be. That there is actually a version of you and I going through life, secure, at peace, not so troubled or worried. What are they thinking? What are they going to think of me? But actually at rest, knowing I am taken care of because he knows me and he loves me.